I'll start with a short autobiographical note. Faizabad happens to be my ancestral house, as my parental grandfather belonged to that twin city. Some of my cousins are still very much there, and some indeed were active workers and are still active workers for the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. The first time that I visited Ayodhya, that was when I was not even 10. And then my second visit was about 25 years later. And thereafter, I have been to Ayodhya 3 more times. The last one was just about a couple of years ago. And every time I visited this city, I would refrain from calling it the holy city for the moment. I came back with varied images. My first visit, when I was not even 10, didn't really mean much. I was too small to make much out of that visit. I was taken to various temples. The city is littered with temples even now, many of which I could not even recall, except the big building, which unfortunately is not there anymore. In 1956, that was my first visit, I was told about the masjid that we have known as the Babri Masjid. And I was also told that this was perhaps also a place of birth of our Lord Ram. That's about all that I seem to have remembered then. Anyway, subsequent visits were more enlightening, more informative, more intensive, for a variety of reasons. And I certainly could really feel that one of the inspirations that I have had in history writing, how true he was. I'm talking about a man called Professor D. Kosambi, not a professional historian, a mathematician as a profession, but who, through his writings on Indian history in general and early Indian history in particular, changed the paradigm of history writing for all times to come. And that was in the 50s. He used to say that any historian worth his salt must be an indefatigable field worker. If you do not visit the places with which you are concerned in writing your history, you will perhaps not be able to write the right kind of history. And the more I reflect on Ayodhya now, in this 21st century, I feel how true he was in underlining the need for field work for writing of history. Well, I hope I won't be too wrong in assuming that even if most of you haven't been to this place called Ayodhya, most of you would certainly be familiar with it because of the recent happenings of the last 3 decades in particular. And I'm sure all of you would be able to recall the dastardly events of the day 23 years ago. I hope you also remember that 6th December also happens to be the day when Baba Sahib Ambedkar breathed his last. The day for the demolition was carefully chosen. And those who planned this act for the 6th had known full well that Baba Sahib had breathed his last then, on that day. I hope you would also be recalling that Ayodhya was picked up as a flashpoint largely because of the heat that was generated by what we now call mandalization of Indian politics. So it was not an innocuous decision to undertake the job on the 6th of December, the day when Ambedkar Sahib breathed his last. Don't forget that link. Because that keeps on recurring every now and then. The latest being the debate in the parliament on remembering Ambedkar for Indian constitution and so on and so forth. So the forces that have been behind the Ayodhya are also quite in a fix as to how to deal with these two forces. So the politics of the whole development had always been there, is here, and I assume it will continue to have that kind of linkage. It's not a coincidence again that the RSS chief 2 days ago and Bajrang Dal today once again raked up the necessity of building the temple at Ayodhya. These are not incidental observations. I should like to say that these are pointers of the direction in which the developments are likely to take place in the coming days and years. Now, having made these preliminary remarks, let me share my ideas with you about what exactly I have understood as Ayodhya. Well, today all of us know that it has been reduced to a position of being a hotly contested site of great religious significance, perhaps also of emotional attachment for one particular religious community, the Hindus. But has that indeed been the case about this important center of pilgrimage? We need to reflect on that question. The reason why this particular presentation has been titled as Ayodhya, a symbol of syncretic cultures, is precisely because we need to demolish this image which has been created in last 3 decades in particular. We all know about the antiquity of our history and culture, and we know that it tells us a great deal about the ethos of what we would like to identify as Indian people and their larger makeup of cultural values, the things for which they stood, the reason why the identity of these people has remained quite indelible in our minds. कहते हैं ना कि अस्थि मिटती नहीं वाली बात, तो ऐसा क्यों है? After all, there is something in our historical DNA which really has to be taken note of when we are trying to comprehend a place like Ayodhya. Now, there are various ways of looking at this particular dimension of the subject that we are talking about today. Uh, when I was visiting the site as a young boy, amongst various temples, I was taken to a mound, quite deserted one, and I was given to understand, not that I understood much at that stage, that this is Parvat Mani, a hill named Mani. It looked a ruined structure, nothing beyond that. But even at that stage, I was quite surprised that the people who took me there, my uncle, he could tell me that people say that there was a Buddhist stupa there. I'm talking about 1956. Obviously, I had not heard about Cunningham then. It's only later on when I visited the site 25 years later in the late 70s that I was more informed, because I had done by then my post-graduation in ancient history. So I had known about Cunningham and his writings. And I could then, in that second visit of mine, understand the significance of spots like the Mani Parvat or the Kuber Tila. Even in their rugged ruins, one could see the grandeur of what the structure may have been centuries ago. Cunningham was able to recall the accounts that were written by the Chinese pilgrims. Some of you might be familiar with the better known Xuanzang or Yuanchang or Zhuangzang as he is now being called. And much earlier, Fahian or Fashian. One came in the 5th century, Fashian came in the 5th century, and Xuanzang came in the 7th century. Xuanzang talks about several Sangharamas in this place called Ayodhya. Of course, he had spelt out the name differently, but scholars have agreed to identify that place as Ayodhya. And he talks about several Sangharamas existing there. Sangharamas is a term which is used for Buddhist monasteries. He talks about several of them in that place that he visited, place which we today know as Ayodhya. And Cunningham was perhaps right in identifying Mani Parvat and Kuber Tila as the extant remains in the late 19th century of some such Sangharamas. I would like to tell you that Cunningham, Alexander Cunningham, was the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India when it was established in 1861. To my mind, there has never been a Director General of that caliber. One who took surveys almost all over India, and not just that, he has left for us phenomenal reports. I'm not talking about his numerous other writings, but the various reports of his fieldwork, which he carried on for decades, are available to us in 24 volumes. No other Director General since then has ever done that kind of fieldwork and left such diligent reports. So Cunningham was not a small person, and therefore we cannot brush aside the kind of data that he left for us in his numerous reports. most of which were published in the late 19th century. It's not just the kind of fieldwork that Cunningham did in the 19th century, but the kind of scholarship that tried to work on different kind of textual traditions that we must try to find out from. We are familiar with the phenomenon of making of a tradition. Let's recognize that traditions are not self-created. We, the human beings, create traditions, develop them, change them, modify them. They keep on evolving. Tradition is not something which is static, that we have created once and for all. No. Traditions are in the making, evolving. And we are fortunate in having different traditions with us. So if somebody tells you that this is the tradition and you must take note of only this, that kind of attitude perhaps would not be easily digested by a historian. The historian's job is to really locate the making of the tradition. So when people tell you that Ayodhya is the birthplace of Lord Sri Ram, yes, we would like to say that this is a tradition which has come down to us for a very long time. At the same time, being a student of history, I also want to ask a question. When does this tradition comes into existence? We must try to locate the building up of that tradition. People will tell you, oh, Ram was born 900,000 years ago, as even the judge in the Allahabad High Court said, on which even the Supreme Court has passed verdict that such things are ridiculous to happen in courts of law. But we know that in that judgment of the Allahabad High Court 5 years ago, one judge did take resort to that kind of traditional evidence, not in the legal sense of the term, but gone by the faith. We must ask ourselves, sit up and ask ourselves as to, is that really possible? For a student of history, faith perhaps has not that much of importance as reason is. And if at all we are really trying to rely upon tradition, quote unquote, then must we just stop at one kind of tradition? Must we not also take stock of what other traditions tell you? I just mentioned Cunningham's observations on Buddhist stupas or Xuanzang's evidence of Sangharamas. There's a whole deal of writing in a language that we know as Pali, which is one of the three major classical languages of ancient India. Sanskrit is one, Pali is another, Prakrit is yet another. The early Buddhist texts, when I say early Buddhist texts, I am referring to those writings which scholars generally associate from the times of the Buddha till at least the early centuries of the Christian era, the common era as we know it today. These are in Pali. And they have preserved their own tradition of this place which they call Ayodhya or Saket. That's another name for this place. And it is quite significant that Ayodhya in its varied forms figures in early Buddhist literature and even later Buddhist literature for something like 1500 years. And if you are indeed talking about Ayodhya's association with Rama, then how can we forget a narrative which is called Dasharath Jatak? It's in Pali, maybe older than the Rama story as we find in Valmiki's Ramayana. Can I ask you one question? Do you know that there's a difference between Ramayana and Ramcharitmanas? How many of you know the difference? Those who have studied history need not raise their hands. Those who have not read history, are they familiar with this difference? All right, okay, I'll take it. What Tulsidas has written in Avadhi is Ramcharitmanas. What Valmiki has written, Ramayana, that's in Sanskrit. All right, okay. But let's try to recognize that even if you are taking Valmiki's Ramayana into account, which I may tell you is perhaps not the earliest version of Ramayana anyway, but even if you take it so, and you go by the nucleus of that story, then you are well advised to compare it with Dasharath Jatak. We all know that Dasharath was the father of Lord Ram. But Dasharath Jatak tells you a totally different version of Ramasaga, where Ram and Sita figure as siblings rather than a husband and wife. So there is an alternative there, alternative tradition there. Can we be oblivious of that? Perhaps not. Then you have a whole lot of writings produced by the Jainas. A very long tradition where they associate Ayodhya with some of their major thinkers or Tirthankaras. You probably know that the Jainas have a long tradition of as many as 24 Tirthankaras. Mahavir was the last of those. Mahavir was not the founder of Jain religion. So the literary tradition that you have, whether you are taking Sanskrit tradition or Pali tradition or Prakrit tradition, they are indeed enlightening you to the extent that several other options come before you. That city becomes closely associated with not just Lord Ram, but other religions also. Then look at some other evidences at your disposal that are available to us, which we are able to date rather firmly. Like, for instance, inscriptions. They are very often dated inscriptions. You cannot fudge them. So an inscription of about 12th century clearly says that Ayodhya's presiding deity is Shiva. Similarly, an inscription of 5th century that also talks about, in very close terms, Shiva's association with Ayodhya. So it is not just Kashi or Varanasi, which is the city of Shiva, Kashi Vishwanath, but Ayodhya also happens to be one of those cities with which Shiva is intimately associated. Sculptural evidence. If you look at the whole history of Indian sculptures from the site called Ayodhya and its vicinity, if you take a larger region into account, Awadh as we come to know of it in medieval times, I'll come to that also in a moment. But if you take Ayodhya plus surrounding areas, you will find that the types of images that you find there, the earliest of them, going back to something like 3rd, 2nd century BC, these are not associated with any form of Vishnu worship. Ram is supposed to be one of the incarnations of Vishnu, as Krishna also is. But no image of Ram or Krishna can be dated to that antiquity. Whereas you have images of the Yakshas who were worshipped. You have images of the Nagas, the cobra-headed deities. who were worshipped. You have images of Shiva in varied forms. And it's only later on, somewhere around 4th, 5th century, that you start getting some Vishnu images. But they are not those of Rama. Even if you extend the argument that Rama is just an incarnation of Vishnu, all right, from 4th, 5th century. But older images are non-Vaishnavite images, either of the Yakshas or of the Buddhist Buddhas or the Jinas or Shiva. So non-Vishnuvite images have a precedence in terms of chronology, in terms of sculptural remains. Coming to little later times, say for instance medieval ones, we have a beautiful ode to Awadh. And this one comes from the poet we have known as Amir Khusro. You do well to remember that Amir Khusro's name ought to be taken with a lot of pride for the contribution that he makes to the making of what you and I speak today, the Khadi Boli or Hindi as we call it. Amir Khusro's contribution in the making of that kind of a Hindustani is immense. And one of his poems, which is found in Firaknama, dated to about 13th century, is talking about the beauty of Ayodhya, where he talks about how people of all types, of all economic strata, live happily with all kinds of activities. He goes into the beauties of his nature, its flowers, its petals, its soil, and so on and so forth. जिसको कहते हैं ना उसकी गंध की भी तारीफ वो करते हैं. I read out a few lines talking about Ayodhya. It said, it's a town, it is, but what a town, a garden, the heart of the meanest is calmed here. Its village is like moth and its environs sheer music. All people here wish to please the hearts of others. Good-natured, pleasant and demeanor of all excellent manners are they. From their trade and commerce and craft, they all live in content, whether rich or poor. That's Amir Khusro in the 13th century. Then we have Sheikh Nasiruddin Muhammad Chirag, after whom we have Chirag Dilli. He was a native of this place, Ayodhya. And it's only at the age of 40 plus that he shifted to Delhi and became disciple of another mystic saint, the Sufi saint, Nizamuddin. In the 16th century, we get to read about a very interesting account of an Afghan army returning to Ayodhya, and the people who went out to greet the victorious army, amongst those people, on the one hand were Sufi saints, and on the other hand, common women who were there with their pitchers of water. They wanted to sprinkle water on the victorious army, comprising of people of different religious faiths. What happens in that kind of a narrative, and that's an interesting narrative, the leader of the army, the victorious army, prefers to go to women before he visits the Sufi saints. They are common women out there to greet the victorious army, entering the gates of Ayodhya and just sprinkling water over them. That's the type of culture that's represented in the place that we call Ayodhya, which unfortunately has today become a contested site. We also need to mention in this context that when you are talking about a holy place like Ayodhya as we know it today, again we need to reflect on the actual location of its holiness. As a Tirthasthan, as a place of pilgrimage, Ayodhya comes on the map rather late. There are several other places which figure in various writings right from about 8th century onwards. There are several accounts written from different standpoints by different traditions, and they do talk about places of religious significance. Like, for instance, I mentioned about the Jainas treating this place as a holy place for their Tirthankaras, and we have there an account called Vividha Tirtha Kalpa, an account which is talking about varied places of pilgrimage. And this account is dated to about the 8th century, and it is here that we read about the first and the fourth Tirthankaras having been born in this place. So if you are talking about the tradition of Rama having been born in Ayodhya, you also have the Jaina tradition of not just one but two of their leaders, religious leaders, having been born in this place, and therefore according religious status or sacred status to this place that we call Ayodhya. But here in this another account, 12th century account, which is also on pilgrimage, you get to read about Kashi, Prayag, which is Allahabad, Ganga, Gaya, that is the place of pilgrimage for both the Buddhists and the Hindus. They are talked about as important places of pilgrimage. Ayodhya is relegated into background. This is 12th century. We have an account of the 15th century called Tirtha Chintamani, also only on pilgrimage. That also talks about Gaya, Puri in eastern India, in Odisha, Prayag, Kashi, but again, neither Ayodhya is mentioned nor Ram is mentioned. In 16th century, when Tulsidas was writing his Ramcharitmanas, we have an account, contemporary account, Todar Nandan, written by Akbar's one of the famous Navaratnas, Todarmal. Account is attributed to about 1585. He doesn't mention Ayodhya at all, though he is known to have repaired a temple of Kashi Vishwanath. He gave money for its repairs and maintenance, but in this account, Todar Nandan, he doesn't talk about Ayodhya. Legend has it that Todarmal met Tulsidas. The point that I'm making here is that as a student of history, we are always interested in locating events with specific reference to time and space. So if Ayodhya becomes a place of pilgrimage, for a historian it is important to figure out as to when does that become so. Given the extant accounts that are available to us, either in the form of tradition or in the form of literary writings or in the form of inscriptions or other such accounts, it appears that not until 17th century Ayodhya comes on the map of pilgrimage. That doesn't mean that since it is only 200 years old, therefore we ought to say that it is not important. That's not my point. But my point is simply historical, that when you are indeed reflecting on the tradition, keep such parameters in mind where it is desirable that making of those traditions ought to be located historically as far as possible. That Ayodhya had a phenomenal role in the national movement right from 1857 onwards has also been documented in varieties of ways. We are familiar with the contributions of a man like Wajid Ali Shah. Not many would perhaps like to mention his name, but he literally lost his kingdom because he was a man of a different culture. Awadh was incorporated into British time because the British thought that he was an incompetent ruler, but there are other dimensions also of his reign. He was considered to be a very popular ruler of Awadh, one who was culturally very enlightened, and his contribution in developing the tradition of Kathak dance has been recognized by all. He himself composed various todas, as we know, and his love for music, Hindustani music particularly, has also been fairly well known to scholars who have worked on fields such as this. Ashfaqullah Khan in the 20th century, early 20th century, who also belonged to this place and was hanged in the jail here in Faizabad. So here we have a very, very long tradition of a place which was nurtured by variety of people belonging to different religious faiths, something which we must not lose sight of when we are talking about a place such as Ayodhya. And it is quite tragic that it has been symbolized now more as a contested site, whereas its long history is a history of people living with one another with great bonhomie and mixing with one another in a great passion. So it has a tradition which is a tradition of great syncretic culture. Now, what do we do from here? Is there something happening around us that should be a cause of concern for us? That is not in the true spirit of Ayodhya. I think there is indeed a lot that has been happening around us, which is certainly a matter of concern, certainly to me personally, and ought to be so for all of us who call ourselves Indians. Much has been talked about the increase in intolerance in the society, and people have made all kinds of observations even in a forum of parliament, but try to think about the ramifications thereof. The other day there was a debate in the parliament on Indian constitution and secularism, and our home minister went to the extent of saying that secularism is a very misused word. And there are the people who have very little faith in secularism, let's be honest about it and candid about it. The happenings that have taken place in last few years particularly, and I should like to begin by referring to the events of my own university. I happened to be in the department then. I'm talking about the vandalism that happened in the Department of History a few years ago, I think 2011-12 perhaps, where certain students claiming to be belonging to the Akhil Bharati Vidyarthi Parishad and Vishwa Hindu Parishad, they came to the office of the head of the history department and roughed him up And the reason was that history department had then revised its undergraduate curricula, the BA program. And in that revision, we had prescribed a reading. And this was a course which was dealing with Indian culture as a whole. And one of the readings prescribed there was an essay by A.K. Ramanujan called 300 Ramayanas, which was available in print for very many years, for decades. And it was a prescribed reading, not as a kind of a compulsory reading, but a suggested reading. The reason why the department came under attack was because they thought, the people who attacked the department, they thought that here is a text which is hurting the sentiments of the Hindus. Because the kind of things that Ramanujan had written from different traditions, the very fact that he was talking about 300 Ramayanas should give you an idea how different traditions about the same story are available to us. Dashrath Jatak is just one of the many. There is a Jaina version of Ramayana, there is a Buddhist version of Ramayana, and n number in folk songs, folk music. There are indeed different recensions. So these people objected that this particular text is hurting the sentiments of the Hindus, and therefore the essay should be withdrawn. The Delhi University, in its own wisdom, appointed an inquiry committee. An inquiry committee unanimously said that there is nothing wrong with this particular reading having been prescribed. And yet, it's a pity that the academic council, under the pressure of the vice chancellor, decided to withdraw that particular essay from the readings which were there in the university curricula. This, I think, was symptomatic of things to come. Thereafter, as most of us would be knowing, Wendy Doniger, her book, The Hindus, An Alternative History. I happened to read that book thoroughly. I reviewed it long before it became controversial. Personally, I did not like the book. I had a detailed review thereof. But that apart, the gentleman who went hammers and tongs against this book, Dinanath Batra, under the umbrella of Shiksha Bachao Andolan, we are all familiar with his ideological bearing, his close association with the RSS, his current status of being an advisor to the Haryana government trying to work out education program for them. He's the one who led the movement against Doniger's The Hindus. Matter went to the court, but muscle power won in that battle. The publishers somehow developed cold feet, and under pressure of Dinanath Batra, the book was withdrawn and pulped. That happened in 2014. Despite the fact that the book had received Ramnath Goenka Award, and there was one more award which was given to the author by Maharana of Udaipur, I think, Meva. 2 awards were won by this book in 2012. But Batra thought that this was hurtful to the sentiments of the Hindus. Well, my argument is that if you are not agreeing with that view, who stops you from writing a rejoinder to that? Go ahead. And here I am reminded of a man called Voltaire, who was a leader in France, a philosopher, thinker. An ideology that he represented was one which brought about the French Revolution in the 18th century. The classic statement that he is known to have made: I don't agree with you, but I'll fight till the last breath of my life to defend your right to say what you want to say. That was Voltaire. What's the situation today? The moment there is a dissenting voice, the first thing that people think of doing is to muzzle that voice. Is that good for our society? Ponder over it. The space for dissent is fast shrinking, almost by the day. I'm sure all of you would be familiar with Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, and his monograph called Argumentative Indian, where he traces the long tradition in India about debates and how Indians have always argued amongst themselves and created spaces for dissent. People have not been physically eliminated for their dissenting views. Such phases have been very few. There have been spaces for dissent in varieties of ways. I remember having read a beautiful account of a long tradition of debates amongst the Jainas. Today we talk a great deal about feminine power and liberty of women and so on and so forth. But when I read those debates of the Jainas, starting from about 2nd century BC to something like 17th century, for 2000 years, the two major sects of the Jainas, the Shvetambaras and the Digambaras, they fought each other on the basic question as to whether women are capable of or entitled to work for their salvation, moksha. स्त्रियां मोक्ष प्राप्त कर सकती हैं कि नहीं मोक्ष प्राप्त कर सकती. There is a debate on that for 2000 years, going into such intricacies which you can't imagine. What constitutes a woman? It's not just the physiology, it's the overall mindset, which is part of the construction of gender. We all know today, sociologists have told us, anthropologists are telling us, that gender is a construct. You are not born with a gender in that sense of the term. It's a social categorization. And you find that reflected in that long tradition of debates which the two sects of the Jainas carried on with themselves, among themselves. And that's why the Jainas developed a philosophic point of view called Syadvad, that there are many ways of looking at any problem, not one. You can have different standpoints. You can view the same reality differently from different perspectives. And this, to my mind, was a provision of phenomenal kind of ahimsa in literary tradition. I call it intellectual ahimsa. That you have the capacity to tolerate alternative point of views. You are not crushing them. You are ready to listen. Compare that with what happened to Dabholkar and Pansare and Kalburgi. I wonder what people of this ilk would have done to Baba Sahib today. The kind of things that he has written about Lord Krishna or about the Hindus and so on and so forth. His books are still with us. Would they ban them? I remember when Dashrath Jatak became controversial in the exhibition that was put up in 1993 by Sahmat. There were hordes of people coming to Delhi University Library and ICHR Library, remove this from the library. I was witness to a group of people coming to the library of the Indian Council of Historical Research when the first NDA government came to power in the time of Baat Cheet, telling the library, okay, you have all these Vedas in your library, why do you keep other books? Remove them. There is no necessity for that. Are we going to live with this kind of mindset? That's a poser for you. I would reiterate Voltaire's statement. Think about it, ponder over it. I may strongly disagree with you. But eliminating you physically, muzzling you by one way or the other, handful for people coming and indulging in all kinds of violence and vandalism to gag other people. Is this the kind of society that we want for us? The little bit that we know about Ayodhya, the kind of cultural tradition that it had bestowed upon us, makes us feel that we seem to have come a long way from there. And the things that have now been shaping or about to be shaped in a particular direction would certainly be against the spirit of this city that we have known through the hundreds of years of history of this particular place. The ethos that it has represented ought to be nurtured, not just locally in that place, but that should be taken as a microcosm of the entire country. And that is a cultural ethos which we can't afford to see getting eliminated or shrunk in any way whatsoever. I once again thank the Dwarka Collective for giving me this opportunity and sharing my ideas.